everyone, it's FP Productions, and I'm finally back with another Legend of Zelda ranking video. Last time I shared with you my ranking of every single game in the series, and this time I'm looking at a specific aspect, the dungeons. I'd like to do this for a handful of Zelda games, and I'll be kicking it off with Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. Remember to keep your disagreements civil, because my opinions are bound to differ from yours. Well, I hope you enjoy the video. Jabu's belly is unique, if nothing else. It's not often that a Zelda dungeon, or any video game to my knowledge, takes you inside a living creature. Unfortunately, I've never liked this dungeon much, despite its originality. For one thing, it's just kind of gross. The walls and floor are literally the innards of a giant fish, and for some reason there are monsters, treasure chests, and items inside him. The aesthetic is always a pretty big part of a Zelda dungeon experience, but this one is just nasty. The dungeon is also kind of annoying. I never really minded carrying Ruto around, and it made for some mildly interesting puzzles and character moments, but it could have been handled better. If you happen to lose her, backtracking to go get her again isn't a lot of fun. Other than that, the dungeon just doesn't have much going for it. The unique concepts it brings to the game are a gross setting and a slightly mishandled partner gimmick, making it my least favorite N64 dungeon. At the end of your long adventure, you finally enter Ganon's castle, a final test for you to prove yourself as the hero of time once and for all. The build-up to entering the place is appropriately epic, but the dungeon itself is underwhelming. I like the general concept. You go through 5 small sections that hark back to the main dungeons you've completed, then face a gauntlet of increasingly tough enemies. In theory, it's a great way to test your mastery of everything you've learned up to this point, but in execution it was far too straightforward. In previous Zelda games, the final dungeons were complex labyrinths filled with the toughest of enemies. Getting through them took effort and really felt like a grand feat. In Ganon's castle, however, there's no getting lost. The 6 Sage Gauntlets are located right off the first room and consist of puzzles you've basically already solved before, and then you simply proceed up the staircase until you reach Ganon. The enemies are nothing new and don't pose a very strong threat with their damage output, especially if you've gotten the defense upgrade. Overall, it just doesn't give me quite the final dungeon experience I'm looking for. The organ that plays as you ascend the staircase is a nice touch though, and if I were factoring bosses into this ranking, the dungeon would probably bump up 1 or 2 spots. But I'm looking at just the dungeon itself, and this one sadly leaves me underwhelmed. Dodongo's Cavern, Ocarina of Time's first fire dungeon, has a similar problem to Ganon's castle. I like the first half quite a bit, but it's followed by a lackluster second half. To start, you go through 2 sections that branch off from a large central room. These sections contain enemies exclusive to this area, some interesting puzzles, and 2 mini-boss fights. Once you find the bombs and make your way to the central bridge, you have to use them to light the dead Dodongo's eyes to open the way forward. I always thought that puzzle was pretty clever. After that, though, things become more straightforward. You go through a few rooms so you can reach a block and push it onto the switch leading to the boss, and that's it. There's nothing wrong with this part of the dungeon, but the place as a whole doesn't do quite enough for me to put it higher on the list. A lot of you may be wondering how Ocarina of Time's first dungeon made it this high after I criticized Ganon's castle for being too simple. The difference is that one of these is the first dungeon, while the other one is the last, and for me it's the Deku tree that does its job better. As the series' introduction to 3D dungeons, the Deku tree does a great job of teaching you what to expect. Aside from Navi piping up a couple times to tell you how to do simple things, you have to be observant and piece things together to figure out how to proceed. In the first half, you visit multiple rooms on your way up the tree, where you solve puzzles involving the game's new items. Then you have to jump down from the highest level to break the web blocking you from the bowels of the dungeon. It's simple, but actually stumped me when I first played the game as a kid, since I thought you were supposed to burn it with a Deku stick. It's always been memorable, and goes a long way in showcasing how a 3D environment can create new types of puzzle. In the second half, the puzzles continue to teach you about the game's mechanics. After solving another spiderweb puzzle, which actually does involve burning it, you get a little test of memory with the Deku scrubs before heading to the boss. For a first dungeon, it's a lot of fun and does a great job preparing you for the rest of the game. And on top of that, I just like the vibe. Instead of starting in ancient ruins like previous games, you're inside a tree complete with vines, water, and forest-like enemies, which is an environment I always enjoy in video games. The Shadow Temple's main strong suit is its atmosphere. Everything about it, from its visuals to its backstory to its monsters, creates a grim tone fitting of the temple's name. Most of the traps you encounter are exclusive to this dungeon and really tell you what kind of horrifying place it was. The Shadow Temple is also where you find the hover boots, an item I really enjoy. The boots don't see a whole lot of use, but they're fun when you do use them. And of course, you can't forget about the infamous boat ride in the middle of the temple. Fighting skeletal warriors on a creepy boat deep underground is not only eerie, but also very symbolic of the dungeon's themes. You feel like you're on a journey to the afterlife. As much as the Shadow Temple has going for it, the actual dungeon aspects are a bit lacking. Not every dungeon needs to be a complex labyrinth, of course, and it can be fun going from room to room solving smaller puzzles, but this becomes more of a problem considering that most of the Shadow Temple's concepts were already used in the bottom of the well. I like the idea of having a bigger version of it that you tackle as Adult Link, but a lot of it felt redundant. Overall, the Shadow Temple excels in its atmosphere and has some unforgettable moments, but could have been more interesting with the actual gameplay. The fact that it took this long for a Majora's Mask dungeon to appear is testament to how good they are. As the first one, the Woodfall Temple does just as good a job as the Deku Tree in establishing what's to come. Majora's Mask is much more complicated than Ocarina of Time, and as such it starts off with a fairly elaborate dungeon. The place is pretty large and makes use of a lot of tools. In addition to your regular items, you'll have to alternate between human and Deku Link to get the job done. On top of that, there are 15 Great Fairy Shards to collect, which requires additional observation and puzzle solving. Add on to that the pressure of beating the place before the in-game timer resets, and you have one heck of a first dungeon. The Woodfall Temple also has a pretty strong atmosphere. The music features unsettling chanting and tribal-sounding drums, and the place just feels weird. Overall, none of its puzzles are particularly memorable, and it's the weakest of the Majora's Mask temples, but it's still a fairly solid dungeon. One thing I always love is when dungeons incorporate a little story, and the Fire Temple does that. The Gorons have been imprisoned, and you free them as you progress through the dungeon. On the way, you also meet Darunia, who goes ahead of you and attempts to defeat Volvagia. It's not much, but running into other characters is a nice touch and makes the Fire Temple more memorable for me. Other than that, I also like the dungeon itself. It's large, uses its fire theme well, and has some nicely interconnected rooms. I don't really have more to say. It's not exceptional, but it's a solid Zelda dungeon. Barely missing out on my top 5 is the infamous Water Temple. As frustrating as it was when I first played Ocarina of Time, the place has grown on me a lot over the years. Its complexity is actually something I enjoy in a Zelda game. There are many ways you can go when you first enter which can seem overwhelming, but if you take them one at a time you'll eventually start making progress. I actually like this sense of wandering through a labyrinth, not knowing exactly where to go. It just makes it all the more satisfying when you finally move forward. The main gimmick of the water temple, changing the water level, gives the dungeon a completely new dynamic. Expanding on a concept from A Link to the Past Swamp Palace, the water temple lets you switch between 3 different water levels multiple times. The rooms on a given floor change completely depending on whether they're filled or not. Sometimes you want water in it so you can rise up to an otherwise inaccessible room, and other times you want it dry so you can use your items. The only downside to this is that you have to backtrack to specific points in order to change the water level, and it would have been nice if you could do it from anywhere instead. Maybe the Serenade of Water could have brought the water to whatever floor you were on or something, but I digress. One thing that's not very fun is having to constantly pause and unpause to equip the iron boots in the N64 version. It gets very annoying after a while and really slows the pace. However, the 3DS version fixed that by making the boots a regular item, so that's one issue solved in that version. Other than that, the main point of note is the mini-boss, Dark Link. It's one of the most memorable fights in the game for sure, even though you can cheese it with certain items. In the end, the water temple is a large labyrinth with a dynamic that makes creative use of its environment, but could have been implemented a bit better. Kicking off our top 5 is a Majora's Mask dungeon. The Snowhead Temple is only the second one in the game, but it's large and complicated. As you progress through it, you'll gradually go further up the immense central room, but this takes you down many side passages filled with their own puzzles. I always found this to be a pretty fun way to navigate. One main attraction of the Snowhead Temple is its use of the Goron mask. As a mighty Goron, you'll roll across large gaps, pound switches, and punch away obstacles on your way to the boss. This is the most use Goron Link will get in the game, outside of traversing the overworld faster, and it's nice that his other abilities get their chance to shine. Speaking of punching away obstacles, the pillar in the central room is another aspect I like about the Snowhead Temple. You have to lower the pillar in order to open the way forward, but you can only do that from certain points. Therefore, navigating to those points is a sort of puzzle that ties the whole dungeon together. It makes the place feel satisfyingly interconnected. I also just like the snowy theme. Snow or ice dungeons are usually among my favorites in any Zelda game for whatever reason, so that was bound to get Snowhead Temple a few points. Add on to all of this the stray fairies, and you have one long, complex dungeon with plenty to keep you busy. The third dungeon in Majora's Mask, the Great Bay Temple, continues the trend of complex interlocking puzzles. This time, instead of making your way up a central room, the main puzzle involves guiding water currents throughout the entire dungeon. There are already a few videos out there that explain how this works a lot better than I could, so I won't try to go into too much detail, but I love this puzzle. Depending on which way the water flows, you gain access to a different set of rooms, and at the end, you have to activate water inside a green pipe and follow it back through the dungeon, which ultimately unlocks the way forward. In addition to its clever central puzzle, the Great Bay Temple makes use of my favorite transformation mask, the Zora. It's a blast to guide through the water in Zora form, and Zora Link's combat capabilities are a lot smoother than Goron and Deku. This makes Great Bay Temple all the more fun. The dungeon also introduces an item that, in the N64 version, was one of the best, the Ice Arrow. The 3DS version sadly watered this item down, pun only slightly intended, but in the N64 version you could use it on any water surface in the whole game, and that made it a lot more fun, both inside and outside the Great Bay Temple. Figuring out where to use it was a puzzle, and one I liked a lot. But in any case, the Great Bay Temple is an exemplary dungeon in both versions of the game. far reaches of the desert lies the Spirit Temple. When you first enter, you find the way forward blocked on both sides. On one side by an object you can't lift, and on the other by a hole you can't crawl through. After exiting the dungeon and learning a new song from Sheik, you return as youngling and find a Gerudo woman named Niburu, encountering the same problem you just did. The two of you make a deal, and then the dungeon truly begins. Right off the bat, there's a lot going on here. First of all is the story content. Unlike the Fire Temple, which only teased the idea, the Spirit Temple has its own subplot complete with narrative arcs. Throughout the dungeon, we are introduced to Niburu and the twin witches Kotaki and Kalme, witness Niburu get abducted and brainwashed by the witches, rescue her 7 years later and earn her respect as a hero, and then defeat the witches. It's really impressive that these characters are introduced this late in the game, but still manage to be as memorable as the other major characters, and I love the way this story is weaved into the dungeon. The other concept this dungeon introduces is switching between young Link and adult Link to complete it. This only happens once, and each of them has their own separate section of the temple, but it still stands out. It's the only dungeon in the game where you use both Links, and what you do in the young Link section carries over into the adult section. Those are the two main attractions of the Spirit Temple. The individual puzzles are fine, but not the most creative the series has ever seen. The mirror shield is alright, but again, nothing too special. But the story and the way the dungeon unfolds make it one of the most unique of the N64 era, and possibly the series as a whole. We've finally arrived at the infamous Stone Tower Temple, one of the most notorious, yet most beloved, dungeons in the entire series. It takes all the hallmarks of a Majora's Mask dungeon, the length, complex structure, and use of different mask abilities, and ramps them up to 11 in the most creative way possible. As you first progress through the dungeon, it already expects a lot from you. You have to use the abilities of all three transformation masks, a new Ocarina song you just learned on your way up here, and the mirror shield, an item you also just picked up on the way here. The game expects you to have mastered every tool in your arsenal to solve the puzzles that lie in your path. Eventually you feel like you're getting it, but something is off. There are treasure chests hanging from the ceiling with no foreseeable way of getting them down, and certain things just look out of place. Then you fight the mini-boss, get the light arrows, and, following a strange message, head outside to shoot an arrow at the red emblem in front of the temple. And then the entire place turns upside down. The dungeon has already felt pretty long at this point, but you're only halfway through. You head back inside, and everything is familiar but different. What was once the ceiling is now the floor, and vice versa. You can now get those chests you saw earlier, but doing so requires going through a new set of puzzles. The way the dungeon makes use of its physical space in such a mind-bending way is just incredible. Stone Tower throws everything at you that the game's got, making for a complex, clever, and extremely creative experience. Lurking in the depths of the enchanted forest known as the Lost Woods is an ancient ruin. Though it's called a temple, it's really more of an abandoned mansion. The natural environment has encroached through the walls as time has gone on, filling the place with trees, vines, spiders, and of course, monsters. But soon enough, you discover that the Forest Temple is also haunted by the ghosts of its former residents. All of this combines to give the dungeon an unforgettably eerie atmosphere. It's not just for the atmosphere that this dungeon is my favorite of the N64 era, though. The gameplay, while not quite on the level of other dungeons on this list, is still extremely solid. As you track down the 4 resident ghosts Luigi's Mansion style, you navigate through twisting corridors, block-filled mazes, and even a room where the ceiling collapses on you. There's no Majora's Mask style puzzle tying everything together, and it's not the longest dungeon in the game, but it's still fun, especially as the first adult Link dungeon. That combined with its chilling vibe and enchanting mysteries make it my favorite dungeon in the N64 Zelda games. Well, thank you for watching. Is my list similar to yours or completely different? Let me know in the comments. Next up on my agenda is a Wind Waker dungeon ranking, and even though I can't promise exactly when I'll get around to it, I hope you stay tuned. This is FP Productions, and I'll see you next time.